One of the most misunderstood dynamics in relationships, especially when we talk about avoidant attachment, is why someone can be deeply connected to you, maybe even show real affection, and then suddenly pull away. It feels personal. It feels like rejection. It feels like you did something wrong, but at the core, what's actually happening has less to do with you and everything to do with their internal relationship to control. Avoidants leave to restore a sense of safety that they believe only distance can provide. Their nervous system interprets emotional closeness, not as love, but as threat. Now, this isn't logical. When intimacy deepens, their subconscious wiring starts firing signals that say you're losing yourself. To an avoidant, that loss of autonomy feels like emotional suffocation. So when an avoidant withdraws or rejects you, it's often their way of taking back control of their emotional environment. Think of it like this. When someone grows up learning that vulnerability equals danger, maybe through inconsistent caregivers, maybe through emotional neglect, maybe through constant criticism, they internalize the belief that dependence is unsafe. As adults, they carry that same wiring into their relationships. Love becomes a battlefield between two competing needs, the need for connection and the need for control. Here's the paradox. Avoidants crave closeness like everyone else does. They're not robots. They feel deeply. But connection awakens the very fears they've spent years building walls to protect against. So when intimacy intensifies, when someone starts to see past their defenses, they subconsciously equate it with the loss of freedom, the loss of control, the loss of self. And in that moment, self-preservation takes over, pulling away, rejecting, even ghosting. It's all part of the same reflex. It's the nervous system saying retreat to safety. Now let's break down what that safety actually means. For the avoidant, control equals calm. When they're in control of their emotions, of their environment, of the pace of the relationship, they can breathe. They don't have to face the discomfort of emotional dependency, but the moment they feel someone else steering the emotional ship, even gently, it activates a deep-seated fear of being consumed. And here's the tricky part, that fear doesn't always show up as panic. It can show up as irritation, criticism, or emotional shutdown. They might say, I just need space, or I don't know what I want anymore. But what they're really saying is, I'm overwhelmed by feeling like I might lose control. That's the underlying current. And when they leave, when they create distance, they're not necessarily leaving you, they're leaving the feeling of being powerless in the face of love. Now, from your perspective, it can feel cruel. You think, how can they just walk away after everything? But in their inner world, leaving is the only way they know to self-regulate. It's how they reset, and ironically, it's through that very act of retreating that they begin to feel like themselves again. Once their sense of self returns, the fear calms down. And when that happens, when the storm inside settles, they often start thinking about you again because the emotional charge is gone and they can finally access their feelings without being flooded by fear. But let's be clear, this isn't about justification. Understanding isn't the same as excusing. What I'm saying is that their rejection isn't always rooted in a lack of love. It's often a reaction to love that feels too big to manage. Love for an avoidant is a paradox. It's both the thing they want and the thing they fear most. Psychologically speaking, control is the avoidance currency of safety. Philosophically, it's an illusion of mastery over something inherently uncontrollable, human connection. You can't truly control love. You can't structure it, predict it, or safeguard yourself from its uncertainty. But avoidants spend their emotional lives trying to do exactly that. Manage love instead of experience it. And the moment love stops being manageable, they run. The tragedy is that in running from the loss of control, they often create the very loss they feared, losing the person who could have offered real connection. It's self-sabotage dressed up as self-P protection. And here's where things get interesting. Once they've had time to regulate, to feel horn control again, the absence of connection starts to feel safer. The mind begins to reframe the relationship. The chaos fades in memory. The affection returns in imagination. And they start to think, maybe I overreacted. That's when they come back. But we'll get to that later. For now, it's important to recognize that when avoidants pull away, it's not about dominance. It's about survival. Their sense of control is their oxygen. When they feel it slipping, they'll do whatever it takes to get it back, even if it means cutting off something they care about. To them, that's not loss, that's safety. And that's why you often see this cycle: connection, closeness, panic, withdrawal, relief, and eventually regret. If you've ever been on the receiving end of this, you know how confusing it can be. You start to question your worth, replay every conversation, wonder what you did wrong. But the truth is, you probably didn't do anything wrong. You just touched a part of them that they weren't ready to face. And that's the thing about control. It's an illusion that protects us from vulnerability. But vulnerability is the very thing that builds real connection. What's fascinating here is that the avoidance need for control is actually the mirror opposite of what a secure relationship requires. True intimacy isn't about control, it's about surrender. It's about trust, trusting that you can be seen, heard, and accepted without losing yourself. But to someone wired for avoidance, surrender feels like annihilation. They've built their identity on self-reliance, so leaning into interdependence feels like a threat to that identity. If you peel it back far enough, you see that avoidants aren't really afraid of other people. They're afraid of their own emotional dependency. They're afraid of what will happen if they let go. Because in their early experiences, letting go didn't feel safe. It felt like being dropped. So as adults, they avoid a drop at all costs. But here's the paradox of control. The more they chase it, the more disconnected they become, not just from others, but from themselves. Because love, by its very nature, requires vulnerability. And vulnerability requires the willingness to lose control when you control everything. You may protect yourself from pain, but you also close yourself off from joy. So, when an avoidant leaves, what they're really doing is trying to reclaim a feeling of self they think love took away. They're stepping back into their emotional fortress, where they can breathe again, but eventually solitude becomes sterile, control becomes lonely, and that's when they start to realize that safety without connection isn't peace, it's emptiness. That's why so many avoidants return after rejecting someone. Not because they've suddenly transformed, but because once control is restored, the absence of love becomes louder than the fear of it. And that brings us to a truth worth remembering. Control can keep you safe, but only connection can make you whole. One of the biggest misconceptions about avoidance is that they simply don't feel. People assume that when they walk away, when they reject, when they go silent, it must be because there's nothing going on inside, that they've detached, disconnected, and moved on. But the truth is, most avoidants aren't emotionally detached. They're emotionally suppressed. Suppression is not absence, it's containment. It's like taking a boiling pot of water and screwing the lid on tight. From the outside, it looks calm, but underneath that lid, there's pressure building, steam forming, energy pushing against the walls. Avoidants have learned to live with that pressure by pretending it isn't there. They don't extinguish their emotions, they bury them. And here's where it gets psychologically fascinating. Suppression is an active process. It takes effort. Detachment would mean they genuinely don't feel. Suppression means they feel deeply but are terrified of what those feelings might do to them because emotion in their experience has never felt safe. Most avoidants grew up in environments where emotions were either ignored, punished, or inconsistent. Maybe they had caregivers who were physically present but emotionally unavailable. Maybe expressing vulnerability was met with rejection or ridicule. So they learned early, if I feel too much, I lose control. If I show too much, I get hurt. And over time, that belief becomes a blueprint for survival. So now, as adults, when deep emotion arises, whether it's love, sadness, guilt, or longing, their automatic response is to shut it down before it consumes them. They do this not because they're heartless, but because they've spent years equating emotional exposure with danger. They've trained themselves to mistake stillness for strength. But here's the thing. Suppressed emotion doesn't disappear. It stores itself in the body, in the nervous system, in patterns of avoidance, distraction, and intellectualization. It leaks out through passive withdrawal, emotional numbness, or sudden bursts of anger that seem to come from nowhere. That's why avoidants often seem calm and rational until something tiny triggers them, and they suddenly pull away or shut down completely. They've mastered the art of control on the surface, but underneath there's a storm they haven't yet learned to face. And when that storm grows too loud, the easiest way to quiet it is to retreat, to step back into the illusion of emotional neutrality. That's why after rejection, you might see them appear composed, maybe even relieved, but that's a short-term illusion because suppression always has a cost. The mind can't repress emotion forever. It eventually seeps through the cracks, often when the environment feels safe again. So when time passes, when the dust settles, when they're back in control, that's when all those buried emotions begin to resurface. They start thinking about you again, not because they've suddenly changed, but because the suppression mechanism has loosened its grip. The emotional flood they avoided starts trickling back in drop by drop. Philosophically speaking, this is the paradox of suppression. You can't selectively numb emotion. When you suppress pain, you also dull joy. When you silence longing, you silence love. So the avoidant who protects themselves from being hurt by rejecting connection also protects themselves from being healed by it. They live in emotional grayscale, safe, predictable but hollow. That's why so many avoidants eventually find themselves haunted by nostalgia. They don't process feelings in real time, they process them in retrospect. In the moment, they shut down. Months later, they replay it, reanalyze it, and that's when the emotional weight hits its delayed grief. They can't cry when they should have cried, so they ache when they think they shouldn't. If you've ever wondered why avoidants come back, this is part of the reason suppression has a time limit. When their emotional system stabilizes and the fear subsides, the suppressed feelings reemerge as curiosity, regret, or even longing. They remember the connection. But now, through the filter of distance, without the fear that closeness triggered, they can finally feel again, but only because they feel safe from being overwhelmed. What's fascinating and tragic is that this same cycle reinforces their belief system. The avoidant starts to think, see, I do feel love, but only when I'm alone. And so they confuse solitude with clarity. They believe that emotional distance brings peace, not realizing that what they were feeling is simply the calm that comes when suppression temporarily eases. It's not peace, it's absence of pressure. But here's the deeper inside. Emotional suppression isn't strength, it's self-limiting. It's like holding your breath underwater and calling it swimming. You can survive that way for a while, but you can't thrive. You can't experience the full range of what it means to be human while constantly tightening the lid on your emotions. You see, emotion is not weakness. Emotion is data. It's your nervous system trying to communicate with you about your needs, your fears, your boundaries, your values. When you suppress that data, you don't just silence pain, you silence wisdom and avoidance, often without realizing it, are running on outdated emotional software built for survival, not connection. This is why so many avoidants can be incredibly intelligent, articulate, and self-aware on a cognitive level, but emotionally disconnected from their own inner world. They understand love intellectually, but they struggle to experience it viscerally. Their mind says, I care, but their body says, stay safe. So they live in a constant tug of war between logic and emotion, between wanting to connect and fearing the cost of connection. And here's where compassion becomes powerful, not as an excuse, but as understanding. When you recognize that an avoidant silence is a form of protection, not cruelty, you stop personalizing their distance. You start to see that what looks like indifference is actually fear of being swallowed by their own feelings. But at the same time, compassion must come with boundaries. Because until an avoidant learns to feel safely, they can't love securely in relationships. This means that if you're dealing with an avoidant, your power lies not in convincing them to feel, but in maintaining your own emotional stability. Their suppression is not your responsibility to fix. You can hold empathy for their fear without allowing it to dictate your worth, because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let them face their own silence, to let them sit in the emptiness that suppression creates until they realize that numbness is not peace. And eventually, most do, because the human heart, no matter how defended, craves authenticity. It craves connection. And suppression, no matter how well practiced, always cracks under the weight of that craving. It's not a question of if, but when. What you'll often find is that when avoidants finally begin to acknowledge their emotions, it's not a slow process, it's an eruption. The tears, the realizations, the regrets, they come all at once. Years of buried emotion finally surface, not because someone forced them to, but because the soul eventually rebels against repression. You can't suppress love forever. It's too powerful. So if you've ever felt discarded or unseen by an avoidant, understand this: you weren't forgotten. You were buried beneath their fear. And fear has a shelf life. When it expires, what's left is everything they tried not to feel, because emotion, real, raw emotion, is not the enemy. It's the bridge back to wholeness. And the moment an avoidant stops suppressing, they begin to rediscover not only you, but themselves. And that's the paradox they must face. You can't protect yourself from pain without also protecting yourself from love. One of the strangest things about human nature is that we often don't see things clearly until they're gone. Presence can be blinding. Absence can be illuminating. And for avoidants, this isn't just a poetic truth. It's the very rhythm of their emotional world. When they're close to you, they feel the weight of connection. That closeness awakens all the parts of them they've spent their lives trying to manage: vulnerability, dependency, emotional exposure. So in the moment, it's not that they don't care about you. It's that being close to you activates their fear of losing themselves. And when they pull away, that fear quiets down. They can breathe again. They feel safe again. But what they don't realize is that in reclaiming control, they've also removed the mirror that showed them who they really are. Because that's what relationships do. They reflect us back to ourselves. They show us our growth edges, our hidden fears, our unhealed wounds. For avoidance, that reflection can feel unbearable. It's easier to step away than to see themselves too clearly. But once the mirror is gone, once you're gone, something interesting happens. The emotional contrast begins. See, in the silence that follows separation, the avoidance starts to experience the emptiness that control can't fill. The very thing they thought they wanted, distance, peace, freedom, begins to expose its own hollowness. At first, it feels like relief. The emotional noise stops. There's calm, there's order. But after a while, that calm begins to feel like isolation. The peace starts to feel like numbness. The control that once felt empowering begins to feel sterile. And then comes the contrast. Because human beings can't feel the depth of emotion without contrast, without comparison. You can't truly appreciate warmth without knowing cold. You can't truly recognize love until you felt the void of its absence. For the avoidant, distance becomes the teacher they never wanted but desperately needed. Time and space have a way of filtering memory. When they step away, the intensity of connection fades first. The tension, the vulnerability, the moments that made them feel trapped. What remains, though, are the highlights, the laughter, the comfort, the sense of being understood. Their mind, no longer flooded by fear, begins to revisit the relationship from a place of emotional safety. They remember your presence. But now through nostalgia, not pressure, and nostalgia for an avoidant is the safest way to feel love. That's why so many of them come back. It's not that they've transformed overnight. It's that the emotional contrast, the difference between what they felt with you and what they feel without you becomes undeniable. When they left, they believed distance would bring peace. Instead, it brought emptiness. And that emptiness becomes its own kind of pain. What's fascinating is that for avoidance, this realization often sneaks up on them. They're not sitting there consciously analyzing it. They just start to notice little things, a song, a place, a memory, that suddenly stirs something in them. They begin to feel again without the threat of being overwhelmed. The same connection that once felt suffocating now feels like a source of warmth. That's the emotional contrast at work. You could say that absence gives them emotional permission. When you're gone, they can finally explore their feelings without the fear of consequence. They can love in theory without having to risk love in action. And that's both the beauty and the tragedy of the avoidant pattern. They can only feel safe to love you when you're far enough away that it can't hurt them. But this process also serves a deeper psychological function. Distance allows integration. When they're in the relationship, the emotional data is too overwhelming to process. The nervous system is on defense, but when they leave, the body relaxes and the mind can finally start to make sense of what happened. The lessons, the regrets, the realizations, they all start to surface. This is when they begin to understand that what they ran from wasn't you, it was their own fear of losing themselves in connection. Philosophically, this is where the human condition reveals itself most clearly. We are wired to seek equilibrium, yet growth often comes through imbalance. The avoidant thinks balance means control, managing emotions, keeping distance, staying composed. But true balance isn't about control. It's about integration. It's about learning to hold both the comfort of independence and the vulnerability of intimacy at the same time, and absence. That emotional space they create becomes the crucible for that lesson. In absence, they get to test the story they've always believed. I'm better off alone. And for a while, that story holds up, but then the silence starts echoing. The distractions stop working. The moments that used to fill them no longer do. That's when they realize that solitude and loneliness aren't the same thing. Solitude is chosen. Loneliness is what's left when you've pushed everything meaningful away. The emotional contrast grows sharper the longer they're gone. Because while their fear diminishes in your absence, their need for connection doesn't disappear just because it's been suppressed. It waits, it lingers, and when it finally resurfaces, it often feels even stronger than before. Now, this doesn't mean their return is always healthy. Sometimes what brings them back isn't readiness, it's discomfort. They're not always returning because they've healed. They're returning because the emptiness has become unbearable. But that contrast still matters because it exposes a truth they can't avoid anymore. Control without connection isn't freedom. It's isolation. The absence teaches them what presence couldn't. It shows them that peace without love is just quiet suffering. It shows them that safety without vulnerability is just emotional exile. And slowly, they begin to see that the walls they built to protect themselves have also become their prison. That's the turning point for many avoidants when they realize that what they thought was self-P protection has actually been self-deprivation. Because love, when it's real, doesn't take away freedom. It deepens it, it expands it, it gives you the freedom to be fully yourself, not the curated, controlled version, but the authentic, imperfect one. When they begin to see this contrast clearly between peace that's empty and love that's alive, something shifts. For some, that shift brings humility. They start to reach back out, not from neediness, but from awareness. For others, it simply sparks reflection, an awakening that maybe what they feared wasn't love, but their own inability to stay open to it. Either way, the contrast forces growth, and that's really what all of this is about, growth through contrast. Because whether you're avoidant or not, every human being learns through duality. We learn the value of connection by feeling disconnection. We learn what love is by facing the fear of losing it. We discover our emotional truth, not in moments of certainty, but in moments of contrast, when we see both sides clearly for the first time. So if you've been through this cycle with an avoidant, the closeness, the withdrawal, the silence, understand this, their absence isn't proof of indifference. It's part of their process. It's how they make sense of what they couldn't handle in real time. And while that doesn't excuse the pain, it does help explain the pattern, because for them, absence isn't just distance, it's discovery. And when that discovery finally sinks in, when they realize that control without connection feels like winning a game with no opponent, that's when many of them come back, not because they need you to complete them, but because they finally understand what your presence really meant. Because absence at its core is a teacher, and what it teaches most powerfully is this: you can't feel the value of connection until you face the emptiness of its loss.